Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you all, and welcome to another episode of Sapient Thoughts, where we discuss theophilosophical issues, we answer some of the contentions that are brought against Islam, and we offer a robust case for the veracity and beauty of Islam as a way of life, inshaAllah ta'ala. My name is Anwar Arafat, and today we are continuing our problematic hadith and applying our toolkit and understanding it, inshaAllah ta'ala. We are on tool number 5 with our problematic hadith. Remember, the problematic hadith seems to indicate that women are deficient in their intelligence, deficient in their minds, and deficient in their religion. Does it actually do that? This is what we're finding out. Tool number 5. And tool number 5 is access to the books that actually explain the hadith, the shuruh, right? And we did this. I have a whole paper where you can access it, inshallah ta'ala, online. I consulted over a dozen classical books of shuruh that actually go over this, because this hadith appears in many books of hadith, and so any sharh will actually explain it, will go through it. And that's something that we did, and it helps obviously give that understanding. Now, that is a classical understanding. Remember, our sincerity to the religion, our sincerity applying tool number 1, is also realizing that classically, what was important to them isn't necessarily what's important to us. Some scholars problematized this hadith classically, some did not. Now a person might say, hey, wait a second, those who did not, does that mean that they're biased against women? Does that mean that they have an issue, etc., etc.? No, not necessarily. Remember, they had their own issues that they were dealing with in their own lens, their own paradigm. The world was very different. We can apply that, by the way, to almost any era, to almost any geographical place as well. In the West, if I looked 1,000 years ago, what were their comments on women? I would be shocked and surprised. And yet, in some ways, there might be some wisdom to be taken from some of their writings as well. It's not that I completely write them off because they don't see the world as I do. I have to put them in their place and understand that as well. Some of the books of shuruh, by the way, the books that explain the hadith, some of them don't even come across the issue of the deficiency, they don't even address it, because they're not interested in it from that perspective. They're interested in the rulings that apply for the Muslim to apply in their life. So for example, in Sahih al-Bukhari, in Bukhari itself, this hadith appears 3 different times. One time it appears in the book of menstruation because of its comment on menses, where it makes that proclamation that a woman, if she's on her menstrual cycle, she does not pray, she does not fast. Perfect. So that's why he put it in that chapter. So many of the shuruh, many of the explanations are going to tackle the hadith from that perspective because they're already on that chapter. They're not going to address the whole other theological issues that are in it. This is why a person might access some of these books and be like, hey, wait a second, he's not even talking about this. And that's actually correct. In the second chapter that it appears in the book of zakah. And it's because there's an added section where after the Prophet, because remember, the whole beginning of the hadith is where the Prophet ﷺ is actually encouraging them to donate, to give. And so a woman comes to the Prophet ﷺ and she says, can I give my husband charity? And so he says yes, etc., etc. And so she, because of her question, is asking about charity. The scholars will discuss that whole issue of, can a wife give her husband charity if she's wealthier than he is? And that's a whole nother subject for another day, inshallah ta'ala, right? So, depending on where the scholar put it, he obviously has a point because he wants people to understand something, a ruling, etc., etc. So I have to realize that not everybody is going to have the same problems that I have. What we problematize now is not what people problematized a long time ago. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We don't automatically write them off because they don't share the passions that we do, right? Everybody has their historical place. So that's number 5. Number 6, tool number 6, is checking authenticity. And as we said, if a person is paying, attention to this and knows this, since we said it's in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim, both of these, this is of the highest degrees of authenticity. Outside of these books, it appears in Ibn Majah, Abu Dawood, and Tirmidhi, in Muslim Imam Ahmad. It also, a version of it appears in the Muwatta of Imam Malik. And in fact, the version of the Muwatta helps us understand it even more. Even though the version of the Muwatta of Imam Malik does not contain this problematic phrase, which is that they're deficient in their intellect deficient in religion, it has the first part where he's encouraging them to give, and that they constituted a majority of the people of the hellfire, meaning women. 5 different companions have narrated this hadith. So many unique chains, it's almost impossible from a hadith perspective to put any flaw on this hadith so that we know that it's completely authentic. But this is a step that a person can do. If I come across a problematic hadith and I realize it's weak and it goes against a lot of what I understand about Islam, then I can write it off. I know that this probably isn't true. But remember, it's probabilistic in nature. When I look at this and I see, hey, wait a second, the Prophet ﷺ is saying this, checking authenticity is something that a person should do. However, in this case, it's completely authentic. Now, there are people, remember we said, that their bias might cause them to write off hadith in its entirety because of 1 or 2 problematic hadith that they come across, because they don't like them or it doesn't agree with their own paradigm, their own worldview. Now, while understanding that they have a problem, and I completely understand this, in fact, this is why we're doing this, to just write off hadith in its entirety because I don't like it is incorrect, and it's not a stable or sound method, because writing off hadith in its entirety introduces 100 more problems, thousands of more problems than we're solving. I might solve, like in this case, if I just say, well, I don't believe in hadith anyway, so there's no issue. Women are not deficient in their intellect and intelligence. Yeah, but now I've introduced so many new problems, it's not even worth it. It's not even practical or pragmatic or wise. And so we have to realize that it is authentic. Now we have to face it, we have to deal with it. And these are where some of the challenges come in for some people. Tool number 7 is understanding the maqasid, which is there are goals of the hadith, there are goals of legislation, there's goals even within the Quran itself. There's wisdom in everything. Is the Prophet ﷺ trying to say something? He is. What is that? So let's look into it. And we can do this, by the way, we can apply it, and inshallah ta'ala we will when we do the reread. But I want to mention that tool here, that if I know that, even if I don't understand the hadith, or I can at least acknowledge, okay, this is somewhat problematic, I can at least say, I don't understand, but I do know that I trust the Prophet ﷺ, and I trust his wisdom. Maybe there's something behind what he's saying. There's not a problem in saying, I don't know. There's not a problem in saying, this isn't clear. There is a problem in saying, you know what, I don't understand this, so I'm just going to throw it out. That's why we need patience, right? So saying, I don't know, investigating further, I think this is one of the best courses that a Muslim can actually apply. Number 8 and number 9 are both related, meaning understanding the historical context and the context within the other narrations. Okay? Historical context tells us that most of the versions does not mention that there was Eid or there was a khutbah. But in some of them, the ones in Bukhari and in al-Muwatta, mention that there was a khutbah. The Prophet ﷺ gave a sermon and that there was a congregation, people gathered. Now, the version of Bukhari, the narrator says it was either Eid al-Adha or Eid al-Fitr. He's not sure. The version in Muwatta, he actually says it was during the solar eclipse. Now, there's certainty. He says it was during the eclipse. We had the prayer, and after the prayer he gave a khutbah. Now, you don't have to give a khutbah after the eclipse prayer, but he did because people had gathered and he wanted to encourage them to actually give, donate, etc., which is what we should be doing during the eclipse prayer. This makes a lot of sense now, because if it's during Eid, Eid is usually a joyous affair, etc., and he would give the women their own sermon, etc., but he would encourage them to do good and whatnot. But in this one, in this case, he seems very concerned. Plus, the wording in Bukhari, even though it mentions that it could be Eid, actually alludes to the eclipse prayer. Why? He says, I have been shown that you were a majority of the people of the hellfire. Now pause. In the version of Muwatta, the Prophet ﷺ, while he's praying the eclipse prayer, he says, while he's praying, he said in front of him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opened up like a portal or whatever, and he saw paradise in front of him. And he saw from its fruits and its trees, so much so that he says, if I were to reach out with my hand and grab the grapes, he said, I saw some grapes, and grabbed them and brought them, they would have remained here in the dunya, and you would have eaten from them forever. They would have lasted eternally, because the paradise is eternal. And anything in it, even if it's taken outside, is also eternal. He says, لَأَكَلْتُ مِنْهُ أَبَدًا. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removed that, and then He showed him the hellfire, and it frightened him so much so, and he looked and he saw a lot of women inside. This is where he became concerned. This is why after the salah finished, etc., he gave a general sermon, and then he went to the women specifically to remind them. This is where, when we have this intercontextual or intra-contextual analysis, it actually makes a lot of sense. He just saw this, and now he wants to share that, whatever he saw, with the women that were there, that were present. So he goes over to them. Why specifically the women? He was telling them, look, the reality is a lot of women, especially when it comes to donating money, they rely on their husbands and not on themselves. Because they also, many of them rely on their husbands for their financial upkeep and whatnot and maintenance. But they also rely on their husbands for their good deeds, financially. And so he says, tasaddaqna. The first thing he says, oh women, you need to give charity. A lot of women don't give their own charity. This is what he's saying. And by the way, this is a problem that we still have today. When we do fundraisers, unfortunately, the majority of the people who donate are men and not necessarily women. This doesn't mean that women don't have their own money, but they assume that, oh, my husband will give for us. That's true, the husband will give for you, but you have your own deeds to get as well. Don't wait for your husband. And this is basically what he's saying. And then he says, I saw that you made a majority of the people of the hellfire. He was worried for them. He's not stating a fact. He's trying to make it so that that's not the case. Meaning that isn't necessarily set in stone, number one. Number two, even if it is, women make a majority of humankind anyways. So taking tool number 8 and tool number 9, we can see that now we're adding a lot of context to what's going on. We understand it a little bit better. Step number 10 is the next one that we will do, inshallah ta'ala, when we come back for the next episode, inshallah ta'ala. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.